Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a new week here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I am Bill O'Brien, and I am so pleased to be with you today at the start of a new week in mid-December. It is the 8th day of December, the day after the anniversary of Pearl Harbor. As many of you will realize, and it's become a special day for me because it happens to be my brother's anniversary as well, and so we were talking about that, and I can remember back when the day he got married. It was 46 years ago, actually, and very exciting, very exciting. Anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you here at the Virtual Center. I want to thank you so very much for your willingness to give us a portion of your day. And I'm hoping that we can make your investment of time, your valuable time, well worth the investment, well worth the effort that you give it. I hope that I plan to take your time and your willingness to give us a portion of your time very, very seriously. And I'm hoping that our program will warrant the trust that you have in us here at the Virtual Center, in the Head On Radio Network itself, and in this whole idea of conversation, communication. I was going to say radio, but we're talking cyberspace here rather than traditional radio. But anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you today. I invite you to participate actively in our program by using a phone number that we have reserved especially for that purpose. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's area code 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N. If you would like to communicate directly with me via email, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. I've been doing, in the time since last we were together, which was middle of last week, I've been doing some preparation for programs, and one of the areas that I think it's well beyond time that we got into, and we will be doing that this week at some point in time, I hope, we'll be into looking at the Federalist Papers, more specifically at the Federalist Papers dealing with the creation of the Supreme Court, of the judicial branch of government. Specifically thinking of focusing on Federalist number 78, which is written by Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton is the author of all the papers related to the court system. Madison handles the Federalist Papers related to the legislative system. And I want to get into Federalist 78 in some detail. I've reread it a couple of times over the last few days and have recognized exactly how significant it is and how misinterpreted sometimes it is. Most people will focus on Federalist number 78 as Hamilton's argument for the principle of judicial review. If you read this particular Federalist paper very carefully, you find that it's significantly more than that, and in fact it's not that at all. And we will get into that. But before I did, I've been trying to figure out a way to wrap up, or bring to a logical conclusion the issues that we've been dealing with, that we were dealing with last week here at the Virtual Center, which focuses on the concept of the issue of class, the question of class as it relates to the construction or the drafting of the Constitution of the United States. And you'll remember that in a couple of programs we spent quite a bit of time and attention focusing on the emerging distinctions between class, if you will, during the Confederation period, at the time of the Revolution itself, and then during the Confederation period. And we were focusing specifically on some of the ways, and we didn't complete by any means this issue. The materials that we were looking at came out of Gordon Wood's book, Creation of the American Republic, and we will be back to that in the future, because there's so much in that book related to the drafting or the creation of the Constitution of the United States that I think it's one of those that we will be returning to again and again and again. But the issue we focused on, if you recall, was the emergence of a sense of resentment, if you will, toward the emergence of people who really believed that America was committed to the destruction or to the demise of a class system in America, that this was indeed to be a nation where the ideals of the Declaration, the ideals of equality and freedom and all the rest of it were not merely abstractions, but they were realistic goals that this society was committed to. And so consequently, many people began to take the message of independence, the idealism of the creation of Republican government in 1776. Many people began to take the ideals and the vision of republicanism to heart, and the idea of Republican virtue and one's willingness to surrender one's self-interest for the best interest of the community at large, putting the so-called public interest ahead of your own private interest. And consequently, many people began to point out and resent evidences of class, evidences within society of situations and opportunities where certain people really believed that because of their birth, because of the name or the family they were connected with, or because of the level of education or the families into which they married or whatever, that they were a cut above and a little bit better than everybody else. In other words, people who believed that while we committed as a society to the idea of equality, in real terms, there really was no effort at all to accomplish that as a goal. We talked about the efforts to create an organization of retired military officers who had served under Washington in the Revolutionary War, the so-called Society, the Order of the Cincinnati, and how much political flack and opposition to that group as being elitist that there was, to the point that Washington himself was forced to disengage and distance himself from the organization. And so consequently, we began to see where people really believed that the ideals of 1776 were real objective, real goals that the society was committed to, and began to act accordingly. And then we began to look at how the people on the other end, the traditional elites, if you will, those that were committed to the idea that all societies divide themselves into the capable and the not capable, that there is what many people refer to as a natural aristocracy which must always govern and must always make decisions. And they began to resent the uppity nature, if you will, of these people who suddenly felt that they were equal to everybody else. I'm struck, and we didn't look at this particular quotation, but there's a quotation that comes out in 1776 where I think I made reference to this quote again, where at the time of independence in the late 1770s, a comment is made that people with independence, people are driving around in carriages wearing lace cuffs, who not too long ago were not worthy to shine my shoes. Who do these people think? Who the hell do they think they are? And that kind of sense and that kind of resentment and the fear, if you will, that maybe the optimism and the idealism of 1776 was a bit misplaced. Maybe we put too much faith in people's ability to make republicanism a reality. Maybe, in fact, we need to reemphasize and go back to the idea that people needed to know their place, and they needed to know where they fit and where they belonged and where they didn't. And so what we begin to see is the emergence of class as being a major issue in the 18th century and a major issue during the Confederation period. And there's absolutely no question that the structure of government created under the Articles of Confederation in the 1780s, the efforts to set up a political system that made republicanism possible, was indeed a mistake, because it seemed to be based on an idealism or a vision of optimism that existed in 1776 that maybe was misplaced. And people were losing their sense of balance. And people were beginning to act out of their own class. People were beginning to behave above their brazen, is the expression that we hear oftentimes here in the Appalachian region, that people are behaving out of character. They're pretending or trying to pretend that there's something they're not, and they need to be put back in their place. We talked about the extent to which this indeed was a reality in the 18th century, and we had a number of quotations, principally from Gordon Wood's monumental research study, The Creation of the American Republic, which provided evidences of these kinds of feelings. And the fact of the matter is, we know, because we've looked here at the Virtual Center, we have looked at evidences where this concern about making sure that people knew their place and stayed in their place was a factor driving the drafting and the ratification of the Constitution of the United States. More specifically, you'll remember that we looked at Federalist Number 9, written by Alexander Hamilton, in which he talked about the internal discords and the internal problems of insurrection, the dangers of insurrection and internal civil war that seem to be emerging in a number of states, and how that was tied to the structure of the Confederation itself, and that therefore the new Constitution being drafted needed to find a way to deal seriously with the realities of social organization and political social structure in America under the Confederation. More specifically, a number of weeks ago, you'll recall, we looked in some detail at Hamilton's June 18th speech, in which Hamilton held the floor of the Constitutional Convention for 6 hours, in which he talked about the articles, the weaknesses of the articles, about the promise of the Constitution, and then he acknowledged toward the end of his speech that he really didn't have all that much hope for the Constitution either, because he didn't believe that the government being created under it was strong enough. His model, the model that he openly acknowledged as being the ideal, was the British Constitution and the need for a monarchy, and his belief that the only way to keep people in their place and to maintain security and order in society was with the creation of a monarchy. On the other hand, he acknowledged at the Constitutional Convention that monarchy under the circumstances was not possible in America because America was so committed to the ideals of republicanism. Consequently, he said, what the Constitution had to do was find a way to work around the elements of republicanism and at the same time try to do it in a way which made the outcomes of monarchy attainable. In other words, we had to find a way to make republicanism work in ways which avoided the historical dangers and threats and weaknesses of traditional republicanism. In a sense, Hamilton sort of acknowledged that the Constitution of the United States was the best we could get under the circumstances, and therefore we had to try to make it work. But he was not optimistic. He was much more optimistic when he wrote the Federalist Papers about ratification of the Constitution in the state of New York than he was on the floor of the convention. Within that June 18th speech, Hamilton addressed the issue of class in America. And he made the statement on the floor of the convention, which I have quoted and paraphrased here a number of times. All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The few are the rich and the well-born. The many, the rest of the people. The people seldom judge or determine right. Consequently, find a way to give to the few reasons to support government. And since these people have little to gain by change, therefore, by creating a government which they effectively control, you will ever maintain good government. That particular quotation, that particular speech, is recounted in detail in the notes of Abraham Yates, New York delegate to the convention. The speech is made reference to in Madison's notes, which are much more extensive. But on that particular aspect, Madison does not go into the detail that Yates does. It's Yates's minutes of Hamilton's speech that really feature this. And I think part of the reason for this, and we didn't go into this in detail, but part of the reason for this is that of the three delegates, New York delegates to the Constitutional Convention, two of them, Yates and Lansing, were anti-federalists. They were opponents of the Constitution. Hamilton was a supporter of the Constitution. Consequently, Hamilton was always in the minority in his own delegation. If the New York delegation voted on issues according to their elections, what they ran on, then Hamilton would be continually outvoted by his own delegation 2-1. It stands to reason then, because these delegates disagreed so much on so many different issues, it stands to reason that the most volatile parts of the speech that Hamilton delivers on June 18th would be emphasized in Yates's minutes, Yates's notes. So consequently, he goes into detail on this speech in this particular aspect of it, where Madison does not. But in both cases, both Madison and Yates point out and make, I think, a significant point about the convention's reaction to Hamilton's speech. There is dead silence. And you can interpret that dead silence in a number of different ways. You can interpret it as being evidence of the fact that the members of the convention are shocked by what Hamilton is saying, are stunned, are speechless. and consequently they have little option left except to adjourn and leave the room, which is what they do. On the other hand, you could interpret the reaction to Hamilton's speech somewhat differently than that, because what Hamilton is saying in this speech is what many people in the convention know and believe. It's why they're there. It's what they believe the Constitution of the United States is about, which is preserving the existing social order, preserving a society in which the right people run things. And these people witnessed the dangers that they saw in Shays' rebellion in September, October of 1786, prior to the convening of the convention in May of 87. They came to Philadelphia because they were afraid. They were afraid that many of the things that they grew up believing, many of the realities and the truths that they accepted without question about society and the structure of society and the order of society and all the rest of it, seemed to be in flux, seemed to be in danger. And they felt that the changes brought by the Constitution of the United States needed to address these changes. And that's exactly what Hamilton is saying in his speech. So the fact of the matter is, maybe the reaction or lack of reaction to Hamilton's speech is not shock at what he's saying, but general acceptance of the idea that, as unpleasant as it is, and as much as we don't want to get down on paper expressing our position on this, this is something we believe. He's saying what we know. And therefore there's nothing else to be said. End of question. I would argue the latter. I would argue that Gordon Wood has pulled together enough evidences of concerns about what's happening in society prior to the convening of the Constitutional Convention, that there's really enough evidence to indicate that what Hamilton is saying is what many of those delegates actually believe. They believe that we can't afford to not pass the Constitution of the United States, because the road we're on now is the road to oblivion. Everything that we believe in is in danger. And I think this is confirmed by Benjamin Franklin's closing speech on September 17th at the convention, in which Franklin makes the point that while every member of the convention was opposed to at least one aspect of the Constitution, there was something in there that every one of them would change. The fact of the matter is, after 3 months plus of heated debate and argument with periodic threats of walkout on the part of certain groups of delegates, that this was the best we could get. And what we've got to do is go back to our constituents and sell it that way. That your choices are simple and few, namely two. Pass this Constitution, knowing that if it's not perfect, we can amend it later, or defeat this Constitution and risk civil war, risk insurrection in America, risk the humiliation of other nations in the world for what America stands for. We have everything to lose and nothing to gain, Franklin is saying, if we don't pass this Constitution as is. And through experience, we'll find out what works and what doesn't, and we can fix it, because there is an amendment process built into the document. I think Franklin's concluding speech on September 17th ratifies much of what's in Hamilton's June 18th speech related to the social question. One of the issues that we raised in passing during our discussion of this social question, so-called. Pause for a moment. Lost my train of thought there for a moment. I apologize. One of the issues that we raised in discussing the social question was the issue of the idea of a nouveau riche, the idea that within the debates over class in America in the 18th century, at the Constitutional Convention and throughout the Confederation period itself, seems to fall into the category of traditional debates that often happen in societies between what some sociologists have called old money and new money. Traditionally, in societies, if you study them, as societies experience change, as they undergo change, new elites, new individuals find ways to make it to the top that couldn't before. In other words, one of the elements of change throughout most societies is revealed in the kinds of people who suddenly find that they have influence and power that they didn't have before. And in every one of those societies, what you'll find is some sort of antagonism, some sort of hostility and distrust, if you will, between those who traditionally ran society and those newly rich, those nouveau riche types, who believe that they're being shut out by the traditional upper class or the traditional aristocracy, and they try to fight their way in. The best example that I can think of historically for this, at least within our framework here at the Virtual Center, is the Civil War, the English Civil War of the 17th century. The near two-thirds long, century-long struggles within Great Britain from the early into the mid and late 17th century. The struggles between the Stuart kings and the emergence of Parliament in British politics. The Stuart kings, there were 4 of them that ruled in England in the 17th century. The first was James the First, who came into power in 1603. James the First was a Stuart. He believed in the absolute power of the monarchy. He resented the claims of the so-called nouveau riche at that time, who were the middle classes, the business community, the merchants and the bankers and the investors, who were driving commercial capitalism in England at the time. And while they were making a name for themselves and becoming much more relevant socially and economically in English society, they were effectively being shut out politically by the old aristocracy, by the old landed nobility that traditionally ran English society and English politics. In other words, there was a clash, if you will, among the middle classes and the traditional landed aristocracy. And increasingly, as English politics evolved in the 17th century, the newly emergent middle classes, the business community, tended to control Parliament, whereas the traditional aristocracy tended to support the absolute power of the king. And it stands to reason then that in Parliament's demand for more political influence in English politics, what we are seeing is the playing out in political terms of a much more significant struggle, if you will, between the emerging commercial forces in Great Britain, the middle classes, the emerging business community, as it were. Their play for power within British politics, their efforts to weaken, dislodge, or even unseat the traditional aristocracy. So what we see then is that the same struggle plays itself out in different contexts. In politics, it's a struggle between two branches of government, between the monarchy and the legislative branch, between the king and Parliament. In economic terms, it's a struggle between the traditional landed aristocracy of traditional England and the emergent commercial middle-class interests that are predicting or revealing the future in England, which is the future of economic commercial capitalism. So we're seeing a struggle, if you will, between a modernizing society and a traditional society, between a society dominated by agriculture on the one hand and a society dominated by investment and profit on the other. And that plays out in the struggles, political struggles, between Parliament and the king. The king continues to claim that he rules by divine right, that his power is absolute, that his power ought not to be changed. And therefore, the king resists the efforts of Parliament to wrest elements of control away from the monarchy. James I is succeeded by Charles I, his son. And Charles I comes into power in the 1620s, I believe 1626, but I'm not really sure. And the struggles between the two branches of government became more and more heated until open civil war breaks out in the 1640s. And in the late 1640s, Charles I is captured by the forces of Parliament, is tried and found guilty of treason, and is beheaded in 1649. And throughout the 1650s, England is under the control of a military protectorate. The person most associated with that is Oliver Cromwell. In 1660, Charles II assumes the throne of England in what is called the Restoration, the restoring of the crown, the restoring of the monarchy. There's no question, excuse me, there's no question that part of the Restoration, the story behind the Restoration, is the realization throughout England that the English population is used to a king. They grew up expecting a king. The only kind of society, the only kind of England they've known is an England ruled by a monarch, by a king. And so for a period of 10 years between the death of Charles I and the restoration of Charles II, 1649 to 1660, In the textbooks, this is known as the interregnum, between reigns, between monarchies, the period of the protectorate, the parliament in control under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. But in order to reestablish stability and order in England, Charles II is invited back to the throne, is invited to take the throne of Great Britain. And the Stuart family continues on the throne of England. In the 1680s, Charles was replaced by his brother James II. So what you have in the 17th century is you have four Stuart kings. James I, Charles I, the interregnum, and then Charles II and James II. James II is only king for 3 years. Among the many strikes against James II, he's a Catholic. And it bothers the English population generally that the crown is in the hands of a Roman Catholic. And so in what is called the Glorious Revolution of 1688, James is forced to flee England for Catholic France. And Parliament seeks a king who was a Protestant. And they offer the crown to William of Orange. And his queen, Mary, Queen of Scots. The difference for William, King William, is that he comes back and assumes the throne on Parliament's terms. Parliament forces the king to accept the terms of the English Bill of Rights of 1689. The English Bill of Rights permanently establishes the dominance, the power of Parliament over British government. The history books refer to this as the Glorious Revolution. It's relatively bloodless, which is probably the basis for terming it the Glorious Revolution. What makes it significant is not only does it mark the prevalence of Parliament within British politics, it marks the successful rise of the middle-class commercial interests in England to positions of power and influence. By Parliament becoming the major political force in British politics, the emergent middle classes assume an influence and a prestige that they have long sought and that they finally are able to succeed in secure in 1689 in the Glorious Revolution. But what we see throughout this entire story is the struggle between old money and new money, the struggle between the traditional aristocracy that's trying to hold on and maintain their positions, their priority positions, and the challenges, in this case, the challenge to the aristocracy by the emergent middle classes. But in every society, we see that with change comes new people. And with new people becoming successful comes naturally their assumption that with their economic success ought to come their social prestige and their political power as well. People naturally assume that if they are successful and if they are wealthy and if they are significant in society, then they ought to have the kind of prestige and position and influence that goes with that. And so in every society, you always have this conflict, if you will, between traditional aristocracies and emergent ones, the so-called nouveau riche. And traditionally, the basic justification against these people by traditional aristocracies or traditional power, old money, is that there's much more to position and influence than money. That part of what makes somebody upper class is that they not only have economic power, but they have the kind of social upbringing and background that earns them the respect of the society at large. People who belong to the so-called natural aristocracy are people who are expected to act accordingly. They are people that they are individuals that the people, the masses, look up to and are able to identify as prominent, influential people. They become the trendsetters. They set the tone for culture. They become aficionados in the arts. They become patrons of the arts. They become sponsors of artists and musicians. And they begin to accumulate collections of fine art. And their children, they have the kind of education, their children get the kind of education that prepare them for the positions of influence and power that they will have, that they will assume. And naturally, it always happens that those in power will usually resist those who are outside trying to force their way in by claiming that they don't have the accoutrements of position that upper class must be associated with. The idea being that it takes time, that it takes a number of generations before a family establishes the kind of influence and levels of education and respect for the arts and all that's associated with it. That you can't just move in and suddenly become influential and be expected to possess all of the accoutrements, all the extras associated with positions of power and influence. The idea is that those who are the most, who have a right to be the most influential are easily identified, should be easily identified by the social circles they travel in, by the families that they interact with and intermarry with, by the books they read, by the schools their kids attend, by the amount of wealth and influence they have, by the number of employees they have, the number of jobs they are able to create. All of these things mark the aristocracy. And so there is always this tension between the old and the new. At the turn of the century, the 19th to the 20th century in America, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, you see further evidences, glaring evidences of this challenge of the so-called nouveau riche. Those, the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts and the A.P. Hills and those people that are making fortunes in iron and steel and in coal and in railroads. And these people become so influential financially as a result of the Industrial Revolution that they are trying to muscle their way into the upper strata of society without paying the price, so to speak, without going through all that is believed to be necessary in order to classify one as a member of the aristocracy. And so the old families, the traditional power structures of late 19th century America, tend to resist and resent these nouveau riche types. Among the names associated with the old families in American politics would be the Roosevelts. The fact that the Roosevelts will obviously elect two of them themselves as presidents in the 20th century, in 20th century America. But the Roosevelts are considered to be traditional money, traditional aristocracy. And so they not only resent the nouveau riche, they look down on them. They look down on them as crude and unsophisticated, negligent in education and talent. These are not the models that we want the masses in America to look up to. In today's society, 21st century America, we are experiencing yet again an example of this challenge, or this traditional hostility, if you will, between old money and new money. We see it in technology. We see it in communications. Here at the Virtual Center in previous weeks and months, we have seen examples of it in technology and in communication. And we have cited examples. Bill Gates, who quit Harvard and didn't graduate. And Zuckerberg, Mark Zuckerberg, and Jeff Bezos, and the people who create Amazon and Google and God knows how many of these others. And there has been all sorts of concern among thinking people in America that suddenly we have these people who are not just millionaires, many of them are billionaires. And they are able to exude an influence in society which goes way beyond the cultural upbringing that traditionally goes with being a member of the aristocracy. These people quit school. These people don't have the love and the respect, if you will, for the arts and for fine music and for culture and for education that they ought to have. All they've got is money. In fact, if we really were to be crude about it, we would say that probably one of the grossest examples of this in contemporary society is professional athletes. Those baseball players and football players and basketball players who are signing on who are able to engage in and sign obscene contracts for tens of millions of dollars. And we are so encouraged when one of these people comes along and seems to reflect the kind of class and upbringing that we associate with power, and influence in America. One of the more positive athletes in today's world is LeBron James. Before him, Michael Jordan. The difference was that people began to see that these people had the kind of class and the kind of respect and the kind of balance that seemed, at least in part, to justify their incredible wealth. But the fear is so many others don't. They're signing contracts, and they're spending obscene amounts of money in ridiculous and oftentimes illegal ways. And they're picked up for DUIs and all of this stuff at 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. in the morning in nightclubs. They're out in nightclubs all over the country, and they're up all night in Las Vegas, and they're gambling away obscene amounts of money. And in other words, their behavior indicates that they really don't have the class. They don't have the upbringing. They don't have the psychological and social balance that goes with the amount of money they have. They really don't fit into what we would describe as a natural aristocracy. They may be among America's wealthiest people, but they certainly don't belong in the category of America's classiest people, if that makes sense. Toward the end of last week, I received an email from one of our regular listeners from Horst in Taiwan. And he was responding to the program that we did early last week on this idea of the nouveau riche. And he sent me a link to an article that he had come across, which he felt would be of interest, because it dealt with the so-called nouveau riche of Silicon Valley. The Mecca, if you will, of technology and the concentrated lifestyle of contemporary techies, where everybody who's anybody in today's world of technology and communications wants to be and expects to be and believes that they are a failure if they are not located there. The article that Horst sent is entitled "The Bacon-Wrapped Economy." It is an article that appeared in a local journal, a local publication in the San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley area called the East Bay Express. And it is about the nouveau riche in Silicon Valley. I've spent time this weekend reading this article, which is quite long. It's quite involved. It's quite good. Let me tell you that it's one of the most informative, provocative pieces of writing that I've read in a long time, and I want to begin by thanking Horst for alerting me to it. And I want to encourage all of you to make an effort to get your hands on this article. It won the Arts and Culture Reporting Award for Journalism Excellence from the Society of Professional Journalists, Northern California chapter. It is a division for publications with circulations of less than 100,000. So it's entirely possible that most of us have not had the luxury of getting our hands on a copy of this article, but I encourage you to do so. It's called the East Bay Express, Oakland, Berkeley, the East Bay News. It is dated March 20th, 2013. It's a year old. Year and a half old. It's an unbelievable article, and I'd like to spend some of our time, because I think probably better than I can do, it puts all of this issue that we've been dealing with about class and about distrust among classes in context, in a context of today's world. It's something that all of us can relate to. I think all of us have had concerns, have had issues about the size of some of these professional athlete contracts that we see. The most recent one being the Stanton contract with the Miami baseball team for $325 million over 13 years. Signing a contract for $325 million. One person, one baseball player. It's not, in one sense, it's not that surprising because the size of the contracts has been building up to this for a long time. But when you think about $325 million and what you could do with that kind of money, what we as a society could do, what those elements of society which are living on the edge could do, and the kinds of things that you could do socially if you could find a way to channel that kind of revenue, that kind of wealth, into the social and economic problems associated with massive unemployment and dislocation that many people in this country experience as a result of the latest recession. I think most of us have had issues and been concerned about issues related to this. I know I have. I find this article that Horst shared with me so timely, so powerful, so insightful, and so informative, because it seems to me to bring home not only a little bit about today's America, but it brings out to me the significance historically of these kind of issues and what they mean. After reading this article, I have no doubt, as I imagine what it would have been like for me to have been an elected delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, to have been sitting there and listening to the speech that Alexander Hamilton delivered on the 18th of June, 1787. I think that what Hamilton would be saying is the 18th century version of what this article is going to be saying. It's going to be about the same thing. And it's going to raise the same kinds of questions and the same kinds of concerns among people that I'm sure it did in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention. I think we would be remiss. We would be inaccurate were we to not give the social question its due. I would like to do that, and the way that I think would be a best way to do it would be to take the same issues and project it into today. Let's look at this article. Let's look at the Silicon Valley in 2013 and 2014 in our own time. Let's look at what's happening there. Let's look at the lifestyles of some of the people who are living there. Let's look at how they look at life, how they look at themselves, how they look at America, how they look at the future. Because very honestly, these people are creating America's future. This is the power. This is where the power is. The economic power of 21st century America is here. Whether they know it or not, whether they appreciate it or not, these people are creating America's future. They are creating our future. Therefore, what they believe that they're doing and how they believe they should do it is extremely pertinent and important to all of us, because we're going to have to live with what they do. I think these are the same kinds of issues and the same kind of concerns though unspoken, that were contained in the room housing the Constitutional Convention in 1787. I think in a way all of us can pretend that instead of listening to Alexander Hamilton's 6-hour speech on the 18th of June, we here in 2014 are going to hear the contemporary version of that speech in this article. We are going to get a glimpse at what's happening among today's elite in America, today's upper class. I think you'll find it interesting. I think you'll find it a little bit disturbing. I think you'll find it relevant. We have reached the top of the hour. It is 1 minute after the hour of 2 in the East, in the Eastern time zone today. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back, and we'll get into the Silicon Valley and the attitudes of the nouveau riche there. Please stay with us. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is Bill O'Brien. I would have actually, I enjoyed the music so much, I was kind of reluctant to come back.
Beautiful, isn't it?
It's wonderful. But the other point is I couldn't find out on the computer how to let you know I was here, ready. But I couldn't figure it out.
There's been a Skype update, and it's kind of a pain.
And I can't find where it says send, so I didn't know how to. I kept trying different things and getting strange responses. But anyway, Bob, we're back, and I appreciate it. Thank you so much, and thank you for the music. It was just wonderful. You are listening to the Virtual Center. This is hour 2 of our program on this Monday, the 8th day of December in the year 2014. It is a pleasure to be with you. If you are still with us, and you've been with us through the first hour, I want to thank you for staying with us. If you are just joining us, welcome to the program. We are talking about the issue of the social question, as it were, and we're about to look at an article that appeared in a Northern California publication. It was forwarded to me by Horst, our listener from Taiwan, who thought it would be very, very relevant in light of the fact that we've been talking about the concept of nouveau riche as it relates to class. And this particular article dealt with the idea of nouveau riche as it is currently existing in the Silicon Valley. And after reading the article, I want to, again, thank Horst so much for it, because I think it is timely and insightful and quite appropriate. Our phone number, if you would like to offer your thoughts and your suggestions and ideas related to these subjects, our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's area code 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N, which is quite appropriate. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me directly that way, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. So if you'll bear with me, I've read this article 3 times. And every time I've read it, I keep going back and saying, well, how can I streamline this to the point? Should I omit this paragraph? Should I omit that paragraph? And I'm finding that it's difficult to do. So, if I didn't make the kind of editorial changes that would serve us in the interests of time, I hope you'll understand. Because I didn't want to do anything to diminish the impact and the effectiveness of this particular writing. It is written by Ellen Cushing, and again, it is an article that won the Arts and Culture Reporting Award for Journalism Excellence from the Society of Professional Journalists in the Northern California chapter in a division for publications with circulations of less than 100,000. So this particular piece was written for a publication that didn't receive the broad kind of circulation that I believe the article warrants. Hopefully, by what we're doing here at the Virtual Center, we can at least begin to rectify that. The article begins with something I can really relate to, and I'll explain it in a moment. So let me share with you the opening paragraph. Last July, Google threw an office party. But this being Google, the third largest company in the world as of January 2013, it wasn't really a standard ice cream, cake, and canned beer office party. The event was luau themed. So the company hired staff to dig big holes in its Mountain View campus's lawn and fit spits inside for the purposes of roasting pigs, according to people who were there. There were tables full of food and drinks scattered around. Also on offer, a sophisticated wave machine so that employees could try their hands at surfing miles away from the ocean. A virtual reality type of innovation which allows people to experience surfing in a virtual world through this sophisticated wave machine. Pretty extravagant, this Google party, I thought. You know what struck me is I remember reading in our history books in the late 19th century during the height of the Industrial Revolution, there was a party in Manhattan given by one of the members of the nouveau riche of that era, the Industrial Revolution era. And it was a party in which those who were invited arrived on horseback and brought their horses right into this building in Manhattan. And it was presented in several of the American history textbooks to indicate how opulent and how extravagant and how much these nouveau riche, these people without class and without sophistication, were flaunting their wealth because they didn't seem to have the savoir-faire and the class to know that you don't do that you don't flaunt your wealth, that you don't let your extravagant tastes show, because it creates resentment among those who can't begin to live that way. So a traditional sign, if you will, that a person doesn't have the appropriate class and upbringing necessary to warrant acceptance as a member of the elite is when somebody so flaunts their wealth that they really aren't aware of the message that they are sending. That's a telltale sign among traditional aristocracies that you're dealing with people who don't fit, who don't belong, who financially might have made it, but every other way they haven't begun to know what true position and true influence and true class is really all about. That's what I thought of, was that late 19th century horseback party in Manhattan. This article goes on. In the tech world, nearly everyone has these stories of inordinate wealth. They're repeated in a tone somewhere between sheepish, astounded, and proud, depending on who's doing the telling. And I think that's the key. That the tone as to how these stories are related can either be sheepish, astounded, or proud, arrogant, depending on who's telling it. So much they get passed around and fossilized into legend. In the course of several months and more than 24 interviews for this story, Ellen Cushion, the author, tells us that she heard plenty of these type of stories. The time that Airbnb, the firm Airbnb, flew Ashton Kutcher in for a meeting. The company party with the ice luge, or the one with a surprise appearance by Jane's Addiction. The guy who lost his iPhone several times over the course of a hedonistic weekend, buying a brand new iPhone each time he lost the previous one. You know, the storyteller added, he did it because he could. Or the one who just bought a $5,000 bicycle. Or the story about the one who flew halfway around the world on a moment's notice just to get away for the weekend. At a party for a mid-sized San Francisco startup, those employees happened to have an office in-joke about Smirnoff Ice and found the entire room filled with buckets of it. One of the movies which I've seen on television numerous times, it's old now, it's more than 20 years old, is the movie with Julia Roberts and Richard Gere called Pretty Woman. One of my favorite movies. If you've seen that movie, you remember the part when Richard Gere takes Julia Roberts on a flight in an evening to the opera from wherever they are. You just jump on the plane and you fly 500 miles for dinner or to attend the opera. And it's kind of, it's intended to reveal the degree of wealth and opulence that is associated with the success in the character that Richard Gere plays. What Ellen Cushing is giving us here are examples of this kind of elegance and this kind of arrogance, if you will, in the Silicon Valley of the 21st century. In a New York Times article on technology in 2012, July 2012, the author, Nick Bilton, wrote, quote, "The money here is obscene. The newly minted rich are obsessed with outperforming their rivals. One industry party I attended had a jungle theme. This included a real 600-pound tiger in a cage and a monkey that would pose for Instagram photos. A prominent Googler's Christmas party in Palo Alto had mounds of snow in the yard to round out the festive spirit. It was 70 degrees outside. Sean Parker, a founder of Airtime, threw a lavish $1 million party that included models he hired to roam the room, and a live performance by Snoop Dogg. Bilton's examples from the New York Times article are arresting, Ellen Cushing says, but his point is that none of this is at all uncommon in a region that's seen a massive influx of money in a very short time. In other words, what she's pointing out here is that in today's Silicon Valley, this stuff is not newsworthy. It happens all the time. What we are seeing then in the Silicon Valley is the playing out of the lifestyles of the nouveau riche in today's world. And you can begin to see how those with education and cultural upbringing who have traveled extensively and who know what you do and what you don't do and how you act and how you don't act would feel in the face of this kind of opulence. I go back to last week's program and remind you of the story that I told about being asked during an interview for a job to order wine for an elegant dinner, and how this was a test to see whether in fact I knew how to order wine, which would tell the interviewers a whole lot about my upbringing, my position, the level of sophistication I had, and whether in fact I fit their image of the kind of person they wanted to hold this particular position. It was not in the job description, but in fact it became so significant that it overwhelmed what was in the job description. Ellen Cushing goes on, you don't need to look hard to see the effects of tech money anywhere in the Bay Area. In the housing market, she said, it's obvious and immediate. Rebecca Solnit, in a February essay for the London Review of Books, talks about the impact of Silicon Valley on the housing market. Young people, she says, routinely make six-figure salaries, not necessarily beginning with a 1. And they have enormous clout in the housing market. According to a March 11, 2013 report by the National Low Income Housing Coalition, 4 of the 10 most expensive housing markets in the country, San Francisco, San Mateo, Santa Clara, and Marin counties, are located in the Greater Bay Area. Even Oakland, long considered a cheaper alternative to San Francisco, saw an 11% rise in average rent between 2011 and 2012. All told, San Francisco and Oakland were the 2 American cities with the greatest increases in rent. More young people have more money in a more concentrated place than perhaps ever before. And this is Ellen Cushing's analysis of this particular issue as it relates to housing alone. Old money is being replaced by new, she says. But it's a new kind of new. One that has different values, different habits, different interests than the previous generation. The very rich have always been guilty of excess. But what's changed is that the Bay Area's new wealth doesn't necessarily have the perspective, the experience, or the commitments of the group that it's replacing. This is the key to the conflict between old money and new money, between traditional wealth and the nouveau riche, is that this new wealth does not have the kind of perspective and experience or the commitments of the group that it is replacing. And then we get into something that I think all of us can relate to, the arts. The side effects of the nouveau riche. The arts economy, already unstable, is forced to contend with the twin challenges of changing tastes and new funding models. Entire industries that didn't exist 10 years ago are thriving on venture capital, or are thriving on companies that are thriving on it. It's now possible, she says, to find a $6 bottle of Miller High Life, a $48 plate of fried chicken, a $20 BLT. In parts of the city that used to be known for their bars and taco stands. The region is being flooded with uncommonly rich and uncommonly young people. And the world changes as a result of it. Associated with it is the issue of supporting the arts, patronage. Those who support the arts and those who don't. These nouveau riche in Silicon Valley, often referred to as, quote, Microsoft Medicis. If you remember from medieval Italy, the Medicis were the family that became and fought hard to be known as the patron of the arts. They were the ones who funded the artists, who created some of the world's most gorgeous art and painting and architecture. And if it hadn't been for them supporting the arts, in theory, would have died. In other words, part of what made the Medicis true upper class was because they appreciated the arts and they accepted the value that society placed upon the arts. And they realized that for a society to really be cultured, to really be sophisticated and advanced, it had to support and respect the arts. And consequently, they believed that it was people like them that societies depended upon to sustain the arts. In Silicon Valley today, we have what is referred to here as the Microsoft Medicis. What we have is a tech world that society is looking to and depending upon to save the art world. But the fact of the matter is, because of who these people are, the kinds of projects that get funded, the arts that are saved, are not the arts that any of us would hope for or expect to be saved. Traditionally, most of those people that have been considered patrons of the arts, respecters of the arts, have been older people, have been well-educated, highly sophisticated people. They traditionally represent the older and the richer end of the spectrum. But in today's Silicon Valley, they have become the exception rather than the rule. Amory Sharp, who's Senior Director of Development and Capital Campaigns for San Francisco's American Conservatory Theater, makes the following statement. There's a kind of an old guard here in San Francisco that has been very generous to the arts over the years. This is the old school moneyed class. They tend to be wealthy. But now, today's contemporary money generation in San Francisco are younger. They are in their 20s and 30s, and they are predominantly men. They are 20 and 30-year-old guys. And to be honest, she says, Amory Sharp says, excuse me, Amory is a man. Amory Sharp says, to be very honest about it, they are not interested in the traditional arts. Quote, this is a quote, which I think is unbelievable. This is one of the things in the margin I wrote, wow. If you're talking the symphony or other classical old man bullshit, I would say interest is very low. The amount of people I know that give a shit about the symphony as opposed to the amount of people I know who would look at a cool stencil on the street is really small. Traditional art and cultural institutions are struggling hard to find ways to generate support from today's Silicon Valley nouveau riche to support the arts and support classical music and all the rest of it. One of the organizations that is mightily struggling in this area to make it is NPR, National Public Radio, because they realize that this is where the money is. But the fact of the matter is these people don't have a tradition or a habit or an affection for or an appreciation of public radio. And NPR is having a difficult time. For years here in West Virginia, I was privileged to sit on the foundation board of West Virginia Public Broadcasting. I'm talking about 20 years, for 20 years. And one of the things that we used to discuss all the time was the mission of public radio, of public broadcasting, television and radio. To what extent was the purpose of public broadcasting to satisfy the cultural wants and desires of those who appreciated the arts and classical music? To what extent was our principal mission that of enlisting new people into an appreciation for the arts? To what extent should our focus be on bringing the arts to those people who appreciate them? To what extent should our focus be on bringing new people, young people, school children, to concerts and art museums in order to expose them to the arts and to the culture as part of their educational experience? Believe it or not, this was a very, very serious, heated debate oftentimes. Because the fact of the matter is, NPR receives state funding. It receives public funding. It is dependent upon the gifts of listeners. But there aren't enough listeners to sustain it and keep it on the air. If it wasn't for the large benefactors, for the corporations who are committed to the value of the arts, committed to classical music, committed to theater, and are willing to put up the kind of money that makes the sustaining of these aspects of the arts alive and available, then the arts wouldn't make it. I can remember a number of years ago having a heated debate with a general manager of a local radio station here when he found that I was on the board of public broadcasting in West Virginia. He basically pointed out how resentful he was that public broadcasting got public tax funding, public tax money, whereas he was in the business of having to generate his own revenue. Consequently, his station had to deliver what the people who listened to it wanted to hear. He didn't have the luxury of getting a check every month or every 3 months or every 6 months, however it works, from government. My position was, and continues to be, that part of cultural education, part of one's upbringing and education, should be an appreciation, an introduction to, and an appreciation of the arts. That's always been part of what an educated person is expected to be and expected to do. And therefore, supporting the arts is part of what I would call the public interest. In supporting the arts and supporting public broadcasting, government is doing in the interest of the public interest exactly what it ought to be doing. And my concern and my response to this particular person was, you're basing it on the assumption that if it can't fund itself, if it can't pay its own way, then let it disappear. Let those things that survive, the things that will sell, the things that people are willing to endorse and pay for themselves. If the arts can't make it, then let them go under. My feeling is that the fact that there are not more people willing to support and sustain the arts and the classics is more of a statement about us than it is about them. It's more of a statement about how there are too few of us who appreciate the arts to sustain it in a market economy. And therefore we should be ashamed of ourselves. Because everybody acknowledges and admits that support for and appreciation of the arts is part of what makes a civilization a civilization. And to turn around and throw it into the open market and say basically those that can pay for themselves make it and those that can't don't, is a kind of a Pontius Pilate kind of an approach to culture, where you basically say it's not my fault, it's not my responsibility for the fact that there are too few people in this world or in this country that appreciate the arts. If these people don't have the class and the sophistication to recognize the value in their arts themselves, then maybe they'll begin to appreciate it when the arts disappear. When I was teaching middle school one time, our students for the entire middle school, our 8th grade, all of our 8th grade students were bused. I was in Boston at the time. Were bused to Boston Symphony Hall to see a concert of the Boston Pops under the conductor Arthur Fiedler. Can you imagine the impact on children of attending a concert of music selected just for them in order to expose them to the arts, namely in the person of Arthur Fiedler and the Boston Pops? I have to tell you a story about that experience, and it happened in 1968. And I can remember it like it was yesterday. I was in the teacher's lounge having lunch, and one of my colleagues, one of the other teachers, we were talking about the fact that all of our 8th graders were going to be going the next day to the Boston Symphony Hall to hear Arthur Fiedler and the Boston Pops. And the other teacher said to me, and I will never forget it, exposing our kids to the Boston Pops is like feeding caviar to pigs. I will never forget that. Right there, I knew what our education problems in America were all about. Jonathan Kozol was writing books about the disgrace of education in the city of Boston at the time. I was living it. Exposing our kids to Arthur Fiedler and the Boston Pops is like feeding caviar to pigs. What chance do these kids have? I would suggest to you this is an example of what this entire issue is all about. So what we see then is the difficulty of organizations like NPR trying to raise money to support the arts in a world in which fewer and fewer of the wealthiest people appreciate the arts. These nouveau riche in Silicon Valley aren't going to support NPR because they don't support NPR. Susan Medak, managing director of the Berkeley Repertory Theater in California, is responsible for the following, and this is included in Ellen Cushing's article. Quote, everybody's looking to that young multimillionaire, the billionaire, who is looking to make their first gift, Susan Medak, managing director of Berkeley Repertory Theater, said. But according to her, it's not happening a lot in the arts. At least not as much as it needs to in order to sustain the arts for the future. Young money, after all, typically has young tastes. Maybe it's not insignificant that the very same week the symphony versus stencils conversation happened, the San Francisco Symphony announced in a press release that it was running at a deficit and its musicians were striking over what they complained were unjustly low wages. According to Medak, the director of the Repertory Theater in Berkeley, and other members of the art world, It's not just the donors themselves who are changing. It's the entire ethos of the area. It's what this entire region is all about. A lot of those philanthropic dollars are now going to programs with measurable outcomes, Medak said. I think this is one of the most relevant items in this article, which will continue tomorrow, by the way, because we're not going to be able to finish it today. But this paragraph, I think, will kind of leave us with something to think about. We're at 46 minutes after the hour. A lot of these philanthropic dollars are now going to programs with measurable outcomes, Susan Medak said. This shift toward a more transactional relationship in philanthropy, where you give something and expect to get something concrete back, has continued to escalate. The entrepreneurial infatuation that we now have, and I don't mean that in a loaded way, comes with a notion that the things we're investing in should have a potential to make returns. It's antithetical to the kind of philanthropy that has built institutions in this country, Medak said. Think about that. Most of what these nouveau riche, young, rich people in Silicon Valley are willing to support are ventures, institutions, and initiatives that promise payoff, where you get something back. We're not talking philanthropy in the traditional sense. We're not talking about supporting the arts because a culture needs the arts, because you have the public interest in the forefront of your mind. We are talking about only supporting those aspects, those initiatives, which promise a return, that has measurable objectives, that will be able to prove that the money donated was well spent. In other words, there's a sense of responsibility imposed on the recipient in order to get the money at the front end. You don't give unless there's a payoff, unless there's a return. And so the kind of art or the kind of culture that doesn't seem to promise an immediate payback is not the kind of operation that's going to receive the money and support from these people. What this means to me, this to me says that if the mentality, the worldview that pervades Silicon Valley today, if that continues to pervade the entire society, the entire culture, then I see a danger that the arts, as we traditionally have known them, will not make it. Because the people that the arts depend on for their survival don't appreciate them. And the reason is because these people were not raised in the kind of culture, in the kind of environment where an appreciation for the arts was part of their upbringing. They are rich. They are monumentally wealthy overnight. They hit the jackpot. They became millionaires, multimillionaires, and billionaires overnight. They showed up to pick up the check without any of the background, any of the associated relationships, experiences, perspectives, appreciations that traditionally are part of the support that they are being looked to provide. Consequently, they aren't going to provide it. And what that means is the burden is on the rest of us. At least in the interim, to make up for that support. But in the long term, to find ways to get these people to understand and appreciate what it is that they're letting slip through our fingers, all of us. If there isn't a payback, then they don't want their money in it. Let me ask you a question. Take that same model, that same mentality, and apply it to charity, to support for the poor, for the hungry, for the homeless. Think about it. Hasn't there for a long time been an expectation that in a society where we take care of those who can't take care of themselves, that those on the receiving end of our largesse have some responsibility, or accountability to us? If we are going to give them the money they need, then we need to know that that money is going to be spent in a proper way. And we're more than willing to tell them exactly what that way is. Example. Somebody hits you up going into Walmart, is panhandling at the front door of Walmart or the grocery store or whatever, it doesn't matter where. Would you happen to have 50 cents or $1? And how many of us say, I'm not going to give this person $1. There's plenty of jobs around. If this person spent as much effort, took as much effort finding a job as they spend panhandling, they wouldn't have to be out begging for money. Or they'll probably take the money and buy alcohol with it or drugs. I'm not going to take my hard-earned money and contribute to drug traffic in America, or contribute to the expansion or the growth of alcoholism in America. So I'm not going to give this person my 50 cents or my $1. So in a sense, what's happened in our society from this perspective is that the poor haven't played fair. They haven't done their part. They haven't done what we expected them to do when we agreed to provide them with what they needed. It's the same with welfare. Welfare takes care of people who can't take care of themselves. But we all know Ronald Reagan told us about the welfare queens that drove to pick up their welfare checks in Cadillacs. And so let's cut welfare. In other words, let's blame the victims because they didn't uphold their part of the bargain. What does that mean? It means that we, as a culture, as a society, are doing exactly what this article is saying the nouveau riche do. We are supporting those people who are willing to reassure us that they will take what we give them and use it in a way that we feel is appropriate. There are strings attached. There are obligations associated with our largesse or our philanthropic efforts. What this is indicating in terms of which ventures or which initiatives the nouveau riches are willing to support and which they are not, They are willing to support the ones with measurable objectives, the ones where they can hold the recipient accountable for the use of the money. And what that does is cause the traditional arts to fall through the cracks, because they can't prove their usefulness, at least not easily. It takes the kind of education and sophistication and experience and perspective of those who can appreciate the arts to know how important they are to the society at large. Therefore, we support them. But for them to be able to show their usefulness immediately in some sort of measurable objective, the arts can't do that. So consequently, they're not going to get the support of these kinds of people. And these are the people that are controlling more and more of the funding, more and more of the wealth. And therefore, these are the people that are today's version of those who have traditionally been looked to support the arts in every society. And we are generating and endorsing and celebrating a group of people who have no appreciation for the things that make our culture a culture. The irony is the very elements of the society that have allowed these nouveau riche types to experience the success that they've experienced those aspects of society are going to be lost by depending on these people to sustain them. The arts community, and this is a quote, the arts community now finds itself looking at courting a generation of very generous people in their 30s and 40s who are giving in a different way than their parents might have. Their giving is more results-oriented. They want a deeper understanding of how their philanthropic dollars are going to be used, unquote. And the example that is used here is an organization called Kickstarter. We will begin tomorrow's program by looking at Kickstarter. We are at the end of today's program. It's 58 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you for tuning in to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility on this Monday. I invite you to tune in tomorrow. We'll be starting 1/2 hour later tomorrow, 1:30 in the East. It'll be our regular hour-and-a-half program, and we'll continue with this article, which I think is so informative and in many ways so disturbing, but also so enlightening. I hope you agree. I want to thank you for tuning in today. I want to invite you to come back tomorrow. I want to invite you to encourage your friends and your colleagues to join you and to begin to listen on a regular basis to programming here at the Head On Radio Network. To the Virtual Center, yes. And if you can't tune in at 1 o'clock in the afternoons, all the programs are available on archive. You can go to YouTube, thanks to Horst, and you can get many of these programs on YouTube. I want to thank you. Please be safe. Enjoy your evening, and we'll be back together again tomorrow. Thank you.